And I say it slightly differently. I think when you zoom out really to anti-Semitism, and this is something, you asked at the beginning, like, are we just doomed? The radical right, the fanatics there will always hate us. The radical left, the fanatics there will hate us. The radical jihadis will hate us, right? Is this now this painful, hopeless reality of there's nothing we can do to end this centuries and centuries of hatred? And I think there's a positive message. And you mentioned at the beginning you thought there's positive messages. The positive message is you can look at any of these protests and you see very, very deranged people and very twisted people, right? Not saying everybody who believes in left-wing ideology is twisted, God forbid. There's lots of wonderful left-wingers in the world, right? There's lots of wonderful people who are Muslim and lots of wonderful people who are Christian. And there's lots of goodness in all these ideologies as well, by the way. There's lots of beautiful ideas and things that could make the world a better place and do very often, right? The concern of the left for the downtrodden and the poor, that's straight out of the prophets of ancient Israel. That's beautiful, right? The concern for all these ideologies. Right? We cry over the civilian casualties in Gaza no less than they do. Right? We just understand that they're the horrific ideology of Hamas. Hamas says to Israel, we're coming to kill millions of you, and your only way to get us is we put millions of our own in the fire line of fire. And somehow Israel's managed the miracle of keeping over 99% of the civilians alive who Hamas put in the firing line. Not that it's nice to be a Palestinian in Gaza right now, but what Israel's managed to do to keep so many of them alive who Hamas tried to condemn to death, this is unheard of, right? And properly all over the world, what the left should be campaigning for is, 1 second, no army's ever had as difficult a fight as Israel's got in Gaza. No army's ever had to deal with 400 miles of tunnels underneath every part of the civilian infrastructure, ever, right? With this level of intensity. It makes what ISIS had in Mosul look like child's play. How come Israel, even if we believe the Hamas figures, has the lowest civilian to combatant ratio of urban warfare in history, right? Of where the civilians are there. We should now be calling commissions to study this war, and can we get the British Army, American Army to learn what Israel's doing, so that if we ever do have to go to fight ISIS in Mosul, it won't be killing at least 3 to 1, and the best case scenario says 10,000 civilians to get 3,000 ISIS fighters. 12,000 civilians. I mean, there's a report I saw in The Independent at the time where they thought there was a very reliable Kurdish figure that as many as 40,000 civilians had died in this. Nobody was trying to kill the civilians, but they were stuck as human shields with ISIS underground. How could we learn from Israel so that in the next wars it's going to be more and more civilians being saved? And yes, it's tragic the amount who've died in this war. Tragic. But the amount who've been saved because of precision Israel's had to use heavy bombs because no other armies had to fight these bunkers 50, 100 meters underground. But it's managed to make them precise. So many civilians have been saved. It's moved civilians in different parts of the strip to keep them out of the fighting, even though that's allowed the Hamas leadership to move with them to keep civilians alive. It brought 150,000 tons. That's what should be going on in the world right now. So where's the positive in all this? I'm sorry, I've said a lot of things. I hope so this has been useful. The positive is this. If you look at the most evil people in human history, who everyone would agree the most evil, are the extremes of every ideology. Hitler, Stalin, Osama bin Laden, right? Whichever ones you want to pick. And you can go on. What do they all have in common? An obsessive hatred of the Jew. So what does that tell you? It's the same as what I was saying before about the origin stories. In the psyche of the darkest, most depraved parts of humanity, in the most evil parts of the world, darkness and evil hates what stands for good and light. And the obsessive hatred of the most twisted parts of the extremes of each ideology, the obsessive hatred tells you darkness hates light. And it makes us have this uncomfortable conversation with ourselves. Do we, consciously or otherwise, stand for one of the forces of light in the world? Does the fact that the Jew lies at origin stories of so many ideologies, does the fact that these stories begin with the journey of God's relationship with the Jew, does the fact that the prophets of ancient Israel gave the world a whole new moral way of thinking that echoed through different Western revolutions and ideologies, does the fact that in the 17th century they went back to the Judaic texts to learn new moral thinking, does the fact that the resonance of the call for world peace in a world that obsessed about war, a call for the right to every life, even a disabled child, in a world where ancients used to kill disabled children? Does the fact that the prophets of Israel were the first to articulate world peace as an ideal, care for the weakest as the absolute ideal and the voice of God, right? Does the fact that these things are there and maybe form some of that guilty conscience in parts of the world, does the fact that darkness always comes against the Jew have to do with that? That the Jew has been, as Tolstoy is reputed to have said, was the first to reveal the oracles of God and was the guardian of its prophecy and its transmission. Does that have something to do with the evil of the world hating the Jew? Does that have something to do with the uncomfortable rage in the most agitated parts of the world, always directing it at the Jew? Does that start to explain some of the demonization? Oh, this channel of light in the world. No, it's really dark and really, really evil. Does it explain why so much of the good of humanity loves Jewish people as it loves all parts of humanity? If you love humanity, you usually love the Jew too, right? If you love God and his creation properly, right, there won't be a problem loving the Jew. On the contrary, there'll be something really very strong and attaching in the narrative. And yet on the darker side, the kind of twisted, subconsciously self-hatred, hatred of root, hatred of origin, in the darkest, most Stalin, Hitler, depraved parts, will be darkness hates light. Because if that's true, then that real answer to anti-Semitism, yes, we've got to call out the hypocrisy where we see it, but we can't quell it with reason alone. We can't stop hatred just by pointing out, because if someone hates you and then they constantly come up with 1,000 justifications and you keep changing, if every time you try to change what you do to fit what the anti-Semite says, it's because you're moneylenders. Okay, we'll stop being moneylenders. We'll just live poor in ghettos. No, it's because you're poor in ghettos. You can't change your behavior. But what you can do is shine more light in the world. Because darkness goes when there's enough light. You see, the one message anti-Semitism has for us that probably is correct is we're not doing our job in the world. As Jews, we're meant to be shining a light into the world, as are all good humans, right? But we're meant to be shining godliness into the world. And maybe if when we're not shining enough light, darkness comes to get us, then maybe the answer is let's shine more light. Let's do more good, right? Because in the end, the goodness in humanity will win over the evil in humanity. The goodness that's there in all ideologies, in all groups of people all over the world will win out. And if we want to get to the dream, we as Jewish people do not ever want Israel or anyone else to have to fight a war. We hate the fact that our soldiers who are going in doing the best, our soldiers, our cousins, our friends, right? Jewish people are going to war. And with the best efforts to try to save millions of Israelis from Hamas, and with the best efforts to keep every civilian alive, at the end of the day, civilians are dying. That hurts us. That pains us, that injures us. And when people throw horrific things at us, so we say, oh, you're so ridiculous. But when they shut up and silence, wouldn't we rather that we brought so much light into the world nobody hated and we didn't have to go and fight? So that's not to blame us, right? Self-blaming and self-hatred is not the answer at all, God forbid. Right? All these accusations are unhinged, are horrific, right? Are indicative of what's been all the time in history. And in fact, they're great lessons to us because we never really understood how this mob hysteria works. But the positive is that darkness hates light, then shine more light. And that's not just true of Jews, it's true of all good people in the world. Shine more light, eventually darkness will go. The world's ideologies have moved in a direction of goodness over thousands of years and can do even better. And eventually we'll get to the point where darkness has evaporated altogether. And now I would say, well, sorry, I've talked a lot. Maybe you've got more questions.
Well, it's ironic to me that Jews of all people seem to be the ones that push back on this idea of this chosenness and this mission to, be vessels for God's light. Why is it that we often push back on that role? And do you think that needs to change?
So it's a great question. I think it's because we're embarrassed that sounding chosen sounds like rejection of other. And we're embarrassed that it evokes hatred in other, right? It's very interesting because many groups and ideologies around the world claim to be chosen, and people just smile very sweetly. When the Jew says it evokes this, whoo, again, almost as if subconsciously I'm scared maybe it's true. But actually, the Torah doesn't describe it that way at all. God says to us at Sinai, you'll be mamleches kahanim v'goy kodesh, a nation of priests and a holy nation. Well, priests in many ancient civilizations meant people of privilege. In the Torah, the priest is not given privilege. They have no political power. They can't own land. They're people of responsibility. So what God's saying is, are you willing to take a responsibility upon yourself? But notice something else very powerful. In most cultures, if one group has some chosenness or responsibility, it means everybody else is rejected. The Torah is jam-packed full of the idea that one person taking a responsibility does not mean anybody is rejected. The priests within the Jewish people do not imply there's a rejection of anybody else. The tribe of Levi is chosen. Nobody else is rejected.
Exactly.
The Torah is not, it's not a book about God saying, I've got a special relationship with you Jewish people, the rest of the world. No, on the contrary, you're taking a responsibility to help spread goodness in the rest of the world, not to make them Jewish.
There's no point having priests if they have no one to preach to.
Exactly. And this is the most amazing thing. In Judaism, look, most religions begin their calendar at the point when their religion begins. As if like the rest of history doesn't count. This is the really significant bit. The Jewish calendar doesn't begin at the beginning of Judaism. It doesn't begin with Moses or the Torah or the coming out of Egypt. It doesn't even begin with Abraham. It begins at the moment of Adam, the first, let's say, human to have a certain level of soul or spiritual connection. Judaism is not about the Jewish people. It's about humanity, right? We don't seek all humans to be Jewish. We seek that through what we're bringing into the world and through goodness all over the world, humanity will eventually restore the consciousness that was there in the state called the Garden of Eden, which is another whole talk, when we all become one. So we aren't in the world. Our claim is not a rejection of anybody anywhere. And that's why Jews get very uncomfortable. We're not rejecting anybody. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility. We took on a very important job. That job is written about in the Christian texts. It's written about in the Muslim texts, right? Without rejecting anybody. And whilst embracing so many others in the world who are trying to do good and living the Noahide covenant and the ethical monotheism and all these wonderful things and caring about the weakest in society and wanting the world to be a godlier place, we can embrace all of that. And we do. On our annual Rosh Hashanah, Day of Judgment prayers, we pray for the whole world to become one. Not the whole world to become Jewish, notice. The whole world to be godly and to become one, to join together in godliness. That message is not a message we should be afraid of as a Jewish people, right? It's a beautiful message. It's a message we should want the world to have. But does it imply that humans can be better than humans currently are? Yes, it implies Jews can be better and all humans can be better, right? Does that make people uncomfortable? Maybe, but we shouldn't feel uncomfortable to all want to be better and do better. That should be something we all want to resonate with, right? And if that evokes darkness and hate, then just shine more light.
So you said earlier how the restoration of Israel is so threatening to ideologies that have to have a relationship with Jews and they choose a negative relationship. What's the pathway to people in those camps healing that relationship, coming to terms with the restoration of the Jewish people to the land? How can we help pave that path?
You see, yes, the point is this, is that if a person adopts a philo-Semitic interpretation of Christianity, right, then the Jew coming back to the land is beautiful. It's righting one of the greatest wrongs in history. It's bringing a people who are exiled, tortured, and scattered all over the world back to their homeland. It's bringing a people who once were in a covenant with God in the land who kept the covenant of God out the land, back into that covenant. And it doesn't undermine Christianity. And there's no reason why it should undermine Islam either. There is a theological issue of Dar al-Islam, but there are plenty of Muslim theologians who are easily comfortable with the idea that as long as the state tolerates Islam, it can be called Dar al-Islam, right? If a person has a philo-Semitic interpretation, then the Jew in the land is not a problem. On the contrary, it's writing history's perhaps one of history's greatest evils, and it's bringing goodness, and it's perhaps a sign of redemption, and people might even hear that in religious notions of religious terms. So the answer is already there. But to the people who have to look at the Jew as the rejected evil and who are in the world just to experience their own suffering, coming back to the land is a complete threat to that ideology. And those who already had an anti-Semitic interpretation, that interpretation is now deeply threatened by the return of the Jew to the land.
And
that's like, oh my goodness. What's that?
And they have to get rid of Israel. It must be eliminated.
That's right. It must be the very existence of Islam must intrinsically be evil, right? And we must want to justify its complete dismantling, is a word you'll hear, right? Dismantling, of course, means the slaughter of millions of Jews. It's not going to dismantle by itself, right? But that's the justification. You've got to find justice. Oh, so let's attach the most evil possible words to it and stretch their meaning ludicrously in order to get there. Yeah. But the good news is twofold. Number one, so much of humanity is not in the depraved evil. It's true. What I do think is true is that one of the things we've learned in this is how people can get swept up And, we often scratch our heads and think, how did blood libels work in ancient times? How did people en masse start to believe Jews were killing Christian babies and drinking their blood? Or how did the whole mass of German society turn against Jews in a very short span of time, from being a civilized liberal democracy to such raging hatred? And we can see it all unfolding before us. People start by saying ludicrous things like, the Jews benefited and profited from World War I and humiliated the Germans, and now everybody laughs and thinks it's ridiculous. The Jewish state commits apartheid. Everybody laughs and thinks that's ridiculous. Genocide, lunacy asylum for you, right? But then more people say it, and then hundreds of thousands of people come out on the streets and then the newspapers that advocate start circulating and throwing words around. The Jews were the rich bankers. They were part of conspiracies. And maybe there was a Jewish banker somewhere who benefited from World War I, as there were people all over the world who benefited, and plenty of Jews really lost. But no, look at them all. And maybe they disproportionately benefited, and maybe they disproportionately in war, and maybe this, and stretch. And now you get the obsessive media personalities and obsessive public speakers are starting to throw that, and then and then people in the middle are beginning to say, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something." And then you start to get, the politicians start to scream, "Look at the victims of the Jew! Look at look at these Christian babies dying. It must be to do with the Jews. Look at the Black Death happening. It must be to do with the Jews. Look at these poor people. It must be right. Look at these Palestinians. Look at what's happening when Israel's fighting with the lowest civilian casualty. But the civilians dying. Can we obsess about it for 100 days and show every single one of the cameras? Forget the fact there's 32 other wars going on. Forget the fact there's millions of people. Just look at these victims of the Jew. Let's rage against them. And then those in the middle, I don't know, maybe it is terrible. Maybe it is, and right. And those defending it, I don't know. It's really, really hard. It's really, right. And then, etc. So we're seeing all this play out. We're watching now. All those guys tweeting all the stuff are going to be in the future museums of anti-Semitism. We're going to actually have a live demo where people will be able to go down TikTok and down this and watch and go out to the people who shrieked in the streets and walked to the restaurants shrieking genocide, whilst not caring about the millions of people dying all over the world. Right? We're going to see all this. And we're going to understand not just how it's happening now, but how it's happened in every generation. The same when there's been these raging hordes and mass group things, and people get swept up. Innocent people get swept up into it. People don't always think individually; you think in collective. So the more people throw words at you, and you're in their world, the more I guess there might be truth to it. And that's kind of the stuff that's going on. So that's. That's not the positive I wanted to take out of it, by the way. But that is something at least we can understand the process of the generations.
Yeah.
The positive I really want to take about it is a message which I've shared on other videos before, and it's so powerful. And it comes from my wife's grandmother, who was an Auschwitz survivor. 1944, Hungary, the Germans finally took over Hungary, right, and started mass deportations of the Jews straight to the gas chambers. And she was on a train with, I think, 200 of her relatives, all the cousins, the second cousins, and third cousins, all lived in the same village. 200 of her cousins, and by 40 minutes, an hour into being in Auschwitz, she was probably one of only 3 survivors. And she always thought she was the only survivor. And she's taken groups back to Auschwitz, and I've been back with her. She's not well enough now.
Is this Bobby?
This is Bobby. Have you interviewed her ever on JTV?
I went to Bobby with her.
Oh, wow. So you'll know this. So Bobby, by the way, for those who don't know, is not a Jewish Robert. Bobby means grandmother, and so she's one of those wonderful, wonderful people who just everybody connects to as a grandmother. So they call her Bubby or Bobby, Mrs. Eva Newman. And I'm blessed that I'm married to her granddaughter, and my children are her great grandchildren, some of whom are named after family members and so on. But what was I going to say? So. Cut out some who are named after. I'm not sure that's true. I think about it.
Cut out what? Sorry.
The bit about some of them are named after her family members. Okay. I don't remember if that's true. Okay. And one of the things she would always say, and I've heard other survivors say it too, is if you could put us back in Auschwitz and offer us to be the inmates, the people inside who were sorting clothes or who were in the gas chambers being killed, right? Or we could be the guards sitting around laughing and hating all of us, but having great food and so on. I would go back every single time and be the Jews inside. The little Jew somewhere who tried to do good in the most hellish place on earth. The Jew who gave their last rations to somebody else who was starving next to them. Or the Jew who just said, you know what, I'm being hated, downtrodden, and being killed for what the Jewish people stand for. I would rather always be them. And she managed to walk out there after the biggest darkness ever. Right. And eventually rebuild a family, eventually spread good, spread light, spread good, spread light. And that's this thing, is that there's so much good in the world. It's not all depraved. It's not all dark. There is a lot of good people in the world. But as a Jew, let's be proud. Let's be proud when the darkest parts of the world hate us. Let's be proud when we see this crazy, twisted, convoluted rage that just doesn't make any sense. Right? Let's be proud and understand that, if anything, our job is to bring more light. If anything, our job is to be more good people, to be more Jewish, to be more human, to be more of this in the world. And yes, of course we should, and we do, cry over every Palestinian civilian death that we see. Of course we do. We cry over every Jewish death. We cry over every Muslim death. We cry over every death. And not just in the conflicts that Jewish people are involved in, but conflicts all over the world. Yes, we should be pained and are pained by what's going on, right, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what's going on in Somalia, and what's going on in Yemen, and what's going on in Syria, and what's going on all over the world. And let's understand that we took on a covenant to bring so much light into the world that all of this will eventually go. And all of it will eventually be able to live together in peace, all of us, and love and godliness, and be able to build a humanity that can be a home for God in this world. And humanity has gained by all these positive ideologies, by things that began with the story all the way back with the prophets of Israel in antiquity, right, in the Torah, and has spread. Many values have spread through Christianity, and spread through Islam, and spread through the founding fathers of America, and spread through communists. Lots of ideas have spread and made the world a better place. And if we keep shining light in the world together, then we can make this world a very bright place. And all the darkness and hatred will always have been worth it. Will have been worth it. There's nothing, no greater privilege than that the darkness in humanity keeps coming to attack you, because that means that maybe they see in you a light you never really saw in yourself.
Absolutely. Rabbi Rowe, thank you so much for your time.